Hello to everyone joining us here on our channel, and thank you for tuning in to our ongoing series, The Vinyl Review. This is Billy with Wolf River Music, and today we are at episode number 9 in our album countdown through music history. And like I had mentioned in the last episode, this will be the first musical group who will be returning to our series from a previous appearance. And that band today is the Beach Boys. They were featured in our third video in this series with their album called The Beach Boys Today, which was first released in March of 1965. And while that record fared okay with an average rating of 7.4 on our grading scale, we also made it a point to say that the Beach Boys most likely would have better records and better material, which would come later. So, fast forward now to only just about 4 months beyond this record, and we have a new one. And here it is. It's called Summer Days and Summer Nights. Now, even by 1965 standards, any record coming out just 4 months later after a previous one is still a very fast turnaround. And it would be a challenge for just about anyone or any group or songwriter to be able to turn out a quality follow-up work in this short of a time period. The main focus of this episode is to not only find out how they did with this one, but also to answer the question of why did they produce this record so quickly? Was there a good reason for them to do that? And what effect did this fast turnaround have on the quality of this release? And an even better question is, what effect did this pace of work have on the band, and especially its principal songwriter and musical producer, Brian Wilson? Remember, one of the constant and recurring themes of this series is that each and every one of these records that we review is a product of the environment that the band or the artist was living in at the time, the emotional state they were in, and what was going on around them in their professional and their personal lives. This one is no exception. And in fact, what we're going to find out is that with Brian Wilson specifically, everything that was going on in his life was reflected immensely in all of his music and in all of his writings and musical creations. Brian Wilson is one of the most talented but troubled artists that ever came to prominence in the popular music of the 1960s. He was gifted but incredibly insecure about his talents and in his personal life. In fact, his life was actually tumultuous, and by the late 1960s, he was barely even a shell of his former self, hopelessly addicted to drugs and alcohol, barely able to even function as a normal human being, much less as a productive musician with a wife and 2 young daughters at the time. The pressure on him to consistently turn out hit songs for Capitol Records eventually took a massive toll on him, and he descended into a chaotic lifestyle that was utterly unpredictable and destructive. His actions and his behavior became increasingly bizarre and completely out of control, leaving everyone around him helpless with no real way to reach him or to help him. So, what caused such a talented songwriter and musician to go from being on top of the world, it would seem, with 8 hit albums and about 20 songs that had already cracked the top 40 under his belt by the time this record came out, to becoming a recluse who refused to even get out of bed for months at a time in his own home? Well, for starters, the Beach Boys have only been recording professionally since about September of 1961, when they recorded their very first demo in a cheap little studio in Hollywood, when Brian Wilson was still only 19, and his youngest brother Carl was only 15. It's only been 3.5 years later when they're starting to record this album, and they've already recorded 8 other albums before this one in that same time period. They played hundreds of live shows all over the United States and Canada. They've been to Europe and Australia twice. These guys have been making millions and millions of dollars for Capitol Records, and their work schedule is just absolutely grueling, to put it mildly. They've barely even had time to grow up normally into young men. This is quite possibly the biggest contributing factor to Brian Wilson's mental breakdown episodes, which specifically began with the ill-fated plane trip from Los Angeles to Houston, Texas in December of 1964, when he had a massive panic attack mid-flight and had to be returned home to California about 48 hours later, and he was unable to finish that particular American tour. His young wife, Marilyn, who, by the way, is only 16 years old at this time, insisted that he see a psychiatrist in early 1965, and he was indeed diagnosed as suffering from work-related stress. But there was so much more to it than just that, and it went way, way back to long before the Beach Boys ever even came into existence. We're not going to rehash every single detail of life as it was in the early days of the Wilson family in Hawthorne, California, because we've already touched on a large portion of all that was going on there back in episode number 3. And also because the story is so detailed that we're going to save a lot of it for the episode that's going to deal with the Pet Sounds album, which came out just about a year after Summer Days and Summer Nights in May of 1966. But there is no way to separate the troubled life of Brian Wilson, and brother Dennis Wilson for that matter, from the upbringing that they received from their father, Murry Wilson. Much has been said and documented about him over the decades, and it's basically the consensus that he was a physical and an emotional abuser of his family, and that he was so driven by the idea of control and financial success that he justified everything he ever did based on his desire for those two basic things. And no matter what destruction he caused to his wife or to his 3 sons, he would seemingly do it all again if he could, and with no apologies and with no regrets. Our purpose here is not to document Murry Wilson's life or his actions, mainly because we just don't want to, but also because it's so easy to find out about him from so many other sources that we don't feel obligated to just simply regurgitate all of his assorted history and all of his terrible moments in his life. I will say a couple of things about him and the effect that he has undeniably had over the continued mental state of his eldest son, Brian. I have read many different books about the history of the Beach Boys, but up until recently, I had never read Brian Wilson's autobiography, which is right here. And it only came out just about 8 years ago. No matter how painful it seems, obviously, for Brian to speak of his childhood and the trauma that was inflicted on him from even his earliest childhood memories, he never seems to hesitate to defend his father, Murray's actions, and he always comes to the conclusion that whatever happened, that everything that happened in that household was out of the maniacal devotion that Murry Wilson had to the success of his sons and their musical careers. He pushed them to the brink of insanity with constant verbal harassment and intimidation that included physical beatings and outright humiliation in front of friends, neighbors, other family members, or even just the general public or whoever was within earshot of whatever it was that Murray wanted to scream at them about. Brian literally believes that his father was what actually made the early Beach Boys successful, with his constant badgering of music industry professionals, with his unwavering commitment to have their music recorded properly, and then his belief that the only way to succeed at anything in life was to just shove your way into every single room or office and to fight for every single penny that you could ever possibly get your hands on. Brian Wilson was not cut out for that kind of a philosophy in life. He was sensitive, he was shy and unassuming, and he was not aggressive. He was not rough and tumble like his younger brother Dennis, who, by the way, had an even tougher upbringing from Murry because it was Dennis Wilson who actually decided very early on that he would fight back against the physical abuse of his father, whereas Brian just seemed destined to be victimized by it, and he did not have the mental fortitude to be able to confront his father or to push back in any way. And again, from my readings, it seems like the only one who was able to come away from that upbringing mostly unscathed by his father was youngest brother Carl. I'm not sure how he was able to pull it off, but he must have somehow been able to keep a lower profile in the house, and it would appear that he was able to avoid much of this torture and abuse, mostly directed at his two older brothers. Carl was always known of the three brothers to be the most level-headed and the most spiritual one out of all of them, and the one who was able to live the most stable, normal life with almost none of the drama or the substance abuse that his older brothers fell victim to starting in their early 20s. While I can understand that Brian has some sort of undeniable devotion to the memory of his father and wants to defend the man's character, I also find some things that it seems like he has conveniently chosen to either gloss over or to just forget about out of a mental necessity. One of those things is that while Murry Wilson could be applauded for his unending devotion to seeing to his son's success in the music business, it needs to be said that as soon as the Beach Boys began getting attention from the music industry, and as soon as their songs began making appearances on the U.S. Top 40 charts, that it was also Murry Wilson who immediately demanded that his songs that he had written over the many years be included on any and all of the future Beach Boys records and releases. The other boys, of course, resisted this idea, and then later just absolutely downright refused to even consider it. And this enraged their father, who never really ever gave up on this request, even up to the very end of his final days. You have to remember that Murry Wilson was actually a semi-talented but a failed, frustrated musician who wanted nothing more than to have his own songs recorded and published. So while he may have been out pounding the pavement in order to get his sons and their new band signed to a lucrative record contract, it seems more likely that he viewed that desired outcome as a way to self-promote his own musical wants and needs. Murry Wilson knew virtually nothing about the music industry, and he knew even less about how to record and or to properly produce music in a recording studio. And yet, there he was in the studio control booth barking orders at everyone and telling them what to do and how to do it every single chance that he got. Now, to his credit, what Murry Wilson actually was a stubborn and a pig-headed salesman, and he was relentless in his pursuits no matter how rude he had to be, and no matter how much he was despised by virtually everyone who ever knew him. And that is all that we're going to say about him for now, which is more than enough for our purposes here. And this battle of wills between Brian Wilson and his overbearing father has not even come to a head yet. It actually gets worse. When Brian Wilson separates himself away from the rigors of the touring aspect that the rest of the band has to adhere to, in order to focus all of his energies on writing, arranging, and producing the music that would end up becoming the Pet Sounds album, his isolation and his sense of loneliness began to increase, as does his consumption of LSD and other hallucinogenic drugs. And by the beginning of 1966, he is even more powerless to overcome the constant specter of his father's negative presence in his life. This causes him great mental anguish with very little relief, and this in turn causes him to rely on drugs and alcohol even more and to pull away even further from those who love and care about him. But where we are right now in this history, red flags and warning signs are beginning to go up in this ongoing saga of Brian Wilson and within the Beach Boys' inner circle. This album that I am holding right here was recorded, mixed, and released in less than 4 months. Not because it was destined to become an all-time critical classic of mid-1960s music. No, this album was fast-tracked and pushed through production for one very simple reason, and that was corporate greed. Brian Wilson has already shown and even proven that he has musical skills and production instincts that far surpass anyone else who was in the Beach Boys at that time. He's a better songwriter than Mike Love will ever admit to, even to this day, and he has the ability to hear complex vocal harmony and counterpoint within music that many other well-respected music critics have often compared favorably even to Bach. Brian Wilson has already made it known to the executives at Capitol Records that he is completely sick and tired of writing and recording music with the subject matters of surfing, which he doesn't even do, by the way, cars, and hanging out at the beach or the local ice cream shop to score on high school chicks. But this is exactly what Capitol Records wants from him. They had reluctantly agreed to give Brian some artistic freedom on the previous record, Beach Boys Today, and they allowed him to basically have one side of the record to himself, just as long as the label got what they wanted on the other side. Well, that album, even though it produced 3 very big hit songs and reached up to number 4 on the Billboard charts, did not sell as well as the previous records did, and it did not sell up to the expectations of Capitol Records. So they demanded that Brian Wilson do what they claimed was his real strength, and that was writing songs that appealed to a younger teenage market, and not anything that Brian Wilson was even remotely interested in anymore at that point in his life. And while this album contains 2 of the most widely recognized Beach Boys songs of all time, California Girls and Help Me Rhonda, the second version of this song. Look, this record was created just to sell units. That's it. It's not garbage, but what Capitol Records envisioned, commercially speaking, and from their perspective, did not resemble in any way what Brian Wilson envisioned from his own perspective and from his own artistic or musical endeavors. The label and their principal songwriter, who had already made them more money than any other musical artist in their history, were just simply moving in completely opposite directions. And you know what? Even though these folks that worked up in the top executive offices of this record label may have been corporate scumbags, they weren't stupid. And they knew that the Beach Boys of 1963 and 1964 were not going to last forever. Musical tastes were and always have been fickle at best, and they knew that at some point, the audience that had been buying all of these records were going to grow up into adults and out of their teenage years very soon, and the Beach Boys, or at least the early version of the Beach Boys, and their songs about surfing and cars would not stay this popular for much longer. And they were right. they didn't stay on top for much longer after this. The Beatles were taking the world by storm, as were the Rolling Stones, and other up-and-coming bands like the Who and the Byrds were just around the corner. Capitol Records had to milk this cash cow for all it was worth, and they knew that they had to do it by the end of 1965. And this is why we got this record right here so quickly after this one. And here's another thing. It really didn't take any level of genius at all to see the writing on the wall that music in the middle of 1965 was about to give way to something completely and totally different, and that it was coming from overseas, as in it was coming over from Great Britain. Earlier in this series, we have already discussed the topic of so-called surf music or surf rock, same thing, whatever you want to call it. We pointed out that the Beach Boys were never really part of this Southern California musical subculture, no matter what they wrote about or what titles they put on their records. They were not accepted by the diehard fans of Dick Dale or the Ventures or Duane Eddy. The real surf rock was mostly instrumental music, and it had some very distinct mannerisms about how it sounded and how it was played. And the Beach Boys did none of these things. Now that's neither here nor there, but what needs to be pointed out is just how rapidly surf music fell out of favor when these British invasion groups started popping up on the radio in California and on the national Hot 100 Billboard charts. That particular subgenre of music peaked in 1961, and by early 1964, it had basically tanked in its popularity and had completely disappeared from off of the charts. This is normal, and it happens. It still happens. Does anybody remember the nu metal movement from the mid-1990s up to the early 2000s? No? Maybe? A little bit? What about dubstep from back in about 2007 up until about 2010 when it disappeared? Same thing. Musical subgenres and subcultures, they last a few years and, well, then they just kind of start to fizzle out. I think that not only Brian Wilson knew that his days of Little Deuce Coupe and I Get Around were swiftly coming to an end, but the rest of the band, other than maybe Mike Love, knew it too. This album marks the end of an era for the Beach Boys. It marks the end of the California surf rock sound, or the soundtrack to that Southern California beach lifestyle music. It certainly doesn't mark the end of California music in any way. In fact, that's really just getting started. It's just that it has geographically shifted over to this unlikely spot known as Laurel Canyon. But that topic is for other episodes later, not this one. Oh, look, we have a visitor. Okay, now that we have thoroughly made the distinction that this record right here kind of seals up one chapter of music from the mid-1960s and opens up the possibilities for something completely new and different, let's talk about what this record is and what it is not. And like always, let's start off with some of the good things, and then we'll get to the other half. And that's where we'll just have to be totally honest and rightfully rip some of it apart. The highlight of the album, second song, side 2, Let Him Run Wild. This one stands out for a lot of different reasons. The arrangement is way more complex than anything else on this record. The harmonies are rich, and they really show that Brian actually knew what he was doing here. It has been said that he was trying very hard to channel the sound and the style of Burt Bacharach on this song. And whether or not he was actually successful in that endeavor, I think it's less important than just how the song turned out in the end anyway. When asked about the lyrics of this song in an interview, Brian Wilson gave some kind of a generic description of boy sees girl in bad relationship, wants to see that relationship fall apart so that he can move in later himself. Nothing really much more specific than that. But other people who knew the Wilson family more personally say, no, that's not what it's about. That the song is actually Brian Wilson calling out his father, Murry, for having extramarital affairs with several different women between 1963 and 1965. Whatever the subject matter is about, all I can say is that it's just too bad that the song isn't a bit longer, because the major seventh chords and the horn section are very pleasing to listen to. Equally as beautiful is the final song on the album, which is the a cappella And Your Dream Comes True. And again, unfortunately, this song is only about 62 seconds long. It's a great way to end an album. And quite honestly, most people's attention span would not have lasted more than about a minute anyway for a song that contains no other music other than just simply the voices alone. What you're hearing on this song is 6 vocalists, and each singer is double-tracked. So you're hearing a total of 12 voices all blending together in harmony at the same time. It's very well done. And just like the previously mentioned song, Let Him Run Wild, even without any other instrumentation, this song is musically superior than most of what you're going to find on the rest of this record. Now, a couple of secondary highlights of this album are probably, basically, just the 2 big hits, which include Help Me Rhonda and California Girls. Those 2 songs are so iconic and are just so classic Beach Boys, with catchy hooks and choruses, that it's hard to really dislike them too much. Now, I am sure that there are many people out there who do not like these 2 songs. And, well, if that's the case, then it might possibly mean that they just simply do not like this band at all. Because these 2 songs seem to sum up just about everything that the Beach Boys had been doing during the early days of their career. But now, by the middle of 1965, they were just simply better at what they did. And if those are the highlights of this record, well, then unfortunately, all of them are going to be negated with even more equally disappointing low points. In fact, the first 4 songs on side 1 are, in a couple of cases, just downright awful. You can tell the Capitol Records were making a feeble attempt to front-load this record, so to speak, with what they probably thought were going to be the songs most likely to appeal to Beach Boys fans who liked these kinds of songs. And by that, I just mean simple, juvenile lyrics that don't make you think too hard, and one of them being a Phil Spector cover song by the Crystals that was already familiar to the American public. Anyway, the song Amusement Parks USA is just a terrible song. And it sounds like the Beach Boys covering themselves from 1962. And I'm sorry if you might like this one, but it's just not good. And it has been panned by many other critics over the years. And so we are not alone in thinking this way. Salt Lake City, which is song 4 on side 1, while it is not as bad as that one, it's just forgettable. And it sounds like they spent no more time on writing or recording this than they absolutely had to. And yes, I realize it's fun, and it's meant to be a tribute to their fans in Utah and to Salt Lake City, which was a place that they really liked to play, and a place where they apparently were treated very well. We get it. It's just simply a silly throwaway song that was put on the record to make their label happy. End of story on that one. Again, the first 4 songs on this record are so weak that they tank the rest of the entire record, no matter what else happens to be included. The song I'm Bugged at My Old Man also does not make matters any better. It's weird, and it's quirky, and yes, also possibly creative, and it's not meant to be taken seriously. That is, unless you actually know the kinds of mental trauma that Brian Wilson had actually already dealt with and would continue to deal with throughout the rest of his life due to what actually happened to him as he was growing up. So maybe this song was meant as some type of a light-hearted therapy for him. And if so, well then, okay, and good for him. You can tell that they were having fun with it, and it sounds sort of like a Fats Domino boogie-woogie piano thing. But we also don't need to hear it ever again. Over here, that is. And just so you know, this album was actually re-released by Capitol Records in 1972, with the title of the album being changed to California Girls. And this song, I'm Bugged at My Old Man, along with Amusement Parks USA, both were removed from the track listing of the repackaged record. They were replaced with no other songs up until Beach Boys records started appearing on compact disc. And at that point, they started putting outtakes and other unreleased songs that started being included as part of this record. So apparently, even Capitol Records, several years after this record originally came out, decided that those two songs needed to go. So they got rid of them. Also, we have another issue with Summer Days and Summer Nights, and that is simply that it is just too short. It clocks in at only slightly over 26 minutes, which is almost not even really a full-length record. 12 songs or not, it's just really too short for this to be considered as a legitimate long-playing record. The main reason for this is because, like we have already pointed out, this one was rushed through production, and the powers that be wanted it to be released to the public before the summer in 1965 was over. We gave this record a rating of 6.9, which is a very generous D+. And yes, it is a very big and unfortunate step backwards for them based on the 7.4 rating that we gave to their previous record, Beach Boys Today. But you know what? Don't just take our word for it. Here's a couple of quotes from some of the actual band members themselves regarding how they felt about this record. In 1978, 13 years after it was released, Carl Wilson said, quote, "There was a time when it was uncool to be into the Beach Boys. And when we did that album, it started to bother us, doing this same stuff, because we thought that we were trapped into having to sing about a certain thing," unquote. Here's another one from Brian Wilson himself in 2016. Quote, "Capitol didn't get the hits they wanted from the Beach Boys Today. The songs on that album were great. Everyone thought so. But they weren't successful the way Capitol Records imagined. They imagined a situation where the tower of hits would just keep going higher and higher. After the Beach Boys Today, they put pressure on us to bring them big sales. And if that's what they wanted, that's what I wanted to give them," unquote. Final thoughts here, just to show you how Brian Wilson thinks and that how his thinking is often very different from what most of us would just assume. We mentioned earlier that we thought the song Let Him Run Wild was the overwhelming highlight of this record. Brian Wilson does not agree, and he stated in his own writings that this song is literally his least favorite Beach Boys recording of all time. Not the song, just the recording of the song. He claims that he hates the sound of his own voice on this record, and that he has always felt that he sounds like a whiny little girl, and the vocals sound shrill and shrieky to him. We obviously do not agree with him on this one, but hey, it's his song, and it's his writing and his vocals. He has the overwhelming right to think whatever he wants to think about it. He also claims that many times over the years, he seriously considered going back into the studio and just simply re-recording the entire song because he disliked the original so much. And in 1998, that's exactly what he did. He recorded the song again and put it on an album called Imagination. It was not a Beach Boys record, it was a Brian Wilson solo project. And it had some new material and a couple of other reworked older Beach Boys songs. And guess what? He didn't like how that version turned out any better. We've listened to it. The production is obviously more modern, the drums are louder, and the background vocals, which happen to include Bruce Johnston and Christopher Cross, are definitely more prominent in the mix. As for Brian's voice at the age of 56, rather than his original recording at the age of 22, well, the newer one was definitely not shrill in any way, but I guess the best way to describe it would be that maybe it was a little bit more on the raspy side with the sound of maturity attached to it. But I don't think that it was necessarily any better. And neither did he, apparently. That slickly produced record in general got some very mixed reviews, with many critics accusing Brian of just being completely out of touch with the times in 1998, and that it was way too middle of the road. And then, shockingly, Brian Wilson actually ended up filing a lawsuit against the man who produced this album, Joe Thomas. Brian accused the producer of over-tinkering with the final mixes of this album. So the accusations are that he was adding in instruments, he was taking things out, etc., without any prior approval from Brian Wilson, and then using these production credits as a way of personally enriching himself through various means of manipulation and, again, according to Brian, dishonest scheming against him. So all in all, it sounds like this entire experience was just terribly unenjoyable, leaving a lot of unhappiness and a lot of legal issues in its wake. It also sounds like maybe it just should have never happened in the first place at all. Equally perplexing, Brian Wilson's favorite songs on this Summer Days, Summer Nights record, Amusement Parks USA, and Salt Lake City. And so, we really have nothing more to add about this record after that point. But what we will do is we will go ahead and remind all of you that we, of course, have another episode coming up after this one, which features another returning band, another big returning band. The Rolling Stones will be featured once again with their second record on the vinyl review, which was called Out of Our Heads. It was another summer of 1965 release, just a little more than 3 weeks after this Beach Boys record had come out. The Stones weren't wasting any time either between their releases in 1965. They had 3 in just that year alone. So is that going to be problematic for them too? The only way to find out is to tune in for episode number 10. Once again, this is Billy, and you have been watching the Vinyl Review. Thank you, and good night. Hey everybody, welcome back. Guess what? We have an extra special guest with us today. This is Kira, and since she is a big Beach Boys fan, and since she's down back at home for the Christmas holidays, I thought, it would be kind of cool to get a different perspective since Kira is how old?
21.
21. Okay. And yes, if you haven't seen the resemblance, Kira is my daughter. And she is a college student right now at Utah State University studying what?
Wildlife ecology.
Wildlife ecology. Wow. Straight A student 4.0. Almost. Maybe like 3.98, right? Okay, something like that. She does very well. She's very smart. And so that was one of the main reasons that I wanted to have her on here, because she is so smart. But the other reason is because she is a big Beach Boys fan. Do you have a lot of other friends your age that listen to music from the mid-1960s?
Maybe one person. Maybe, but they're just like weird and listen to like grandpa music. So, like, really nobody.
Grandpa music.
They like 50s music. I don't know what their deal is.
Okay. All right. Well, so today we've been talking about the Beach Boys, Summer Days and Summer Nights. And I want to ask Kira some questions, not only about this record, but just, why is she a Beach Boys fan? She's only 21 years old, and this came out in the mid-60s, even before I was born. This is kind of more my parents' generation's music. I don't think they were big fans of the Beach Boys, but you get the idea. So why? Why are you a Beach Boys fan? How did you discover them?
It was something that I always heard in the house, played by, I think, both my mom and my dad. They had an old iPod that had lots of Beach Boys songs on it, and as well as Beatles songs and other old things like David Bowie. Just something that I kind of picked up because I heard it so much.
Okay.
But I still listen to it today as an adult because I really like their sound. Is very comforting to me, very warm, especially the stuff that they made after Pet Sounds. That's what I listen to the most, is kind of from Pet Sounds on to, I think Surf's Up was the last one. Yeah, if Pet Sounds is on top, then, there's those four that came after, like Friends, 2020, Sunflower, Surf's Up. Those are also around there, maybe just below Pet Sounds.
Okay, so it sounds like basically kind of post-1966 up until about 1971. Surf's Up,
Probably.
I think, was 1971.
Yeah, that's most of what I'm listening to.
Okay, all right. So let me ask you, though, if you could rank in your top 5, 6, or 7 Beach Boys records, where do you think this one would land?
Top 6 or 7? There's those 4 after Pet Sounds. Pet Sounds. So this one would probably be number 7.
Okay, number 7. And number 6 would be what? Today? Beach
I think
Boys
so.
Today?
Yeah,
okay.
I like Today.
All right. Okay.
Yeah.
And then everything prior to that, how do you feel about kind of like Surfing Safari and Little Deuce Coupe and all? No, not really? Okay.
No,
Not into that?
there were a couple like hit songs like Don't Worry Baby I like,
Okay.
but I don't like remember any of
All right.
those
All right.
other albums.
Fair enough. You don't respond the same way to those very early 60s Beach Boys that you do maybe to Pet Sounds and beyond. Okay. So what happened here? What was the breakdown? What was the problem with this record, if there was one?
This one, I know that it came out right after Today, like very
4 months.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And they were busy touring, and I feel like it might have been rushed a little bit. There was not as much thought put into it.
Okay.
They kind of were worrying about the commercial success of Help Me Rhonda, California Girls.
Were they worried about it, or do you think maybe it had a little bit more to do with who they were working for?
Yeah, probably that.
Okay. All right. So maybe this one was a little bit more for Capitol Records than it was for the Beach Boys themselves.
Yeah.
Okay. All right. So maybe a little bit more overtly commercial and just put out just, for the 2 big hits that were on there, obviously, and maybe not so much so for artistic purposes. Would you agree with that?
I think that they very, very briefly wanted to use it to experiment. Like, they had that instrumental song on there that, is not...
Oh, on this one? Mm-hmm. Right. Summer Means New Love.
Yeah, I don't
Right.
think that was a common thing for them to do. It was kind of out of the box for them to have an instrumental song. And then they had an a cappella song at the end, too.
Yeah.
Which I thought was nice.
Okay. So maybe we got a little bit of foreshadowing for what was to come
Yeah.
just less than a year later, which was Pet Sounds.
Yeah, because that one was a lot of instrumental.
Yeah, a lot of orchestration.
Yeah.
Okay. All right. Well, fair enough. Okay, so I think we have kind of figured out where you stand on all of this.
The 2 singles, California Girls and Help Me Rhonda, that they knew that they needed to put on an album, You know, I mean, Help Me Rhonda was already on today, but it was
Different version.
Yeah, they wanted to make a better version,
Okay.
which I do think this version is better
Okay, good.
than the today version. But I don't know why they produced it so soon after today, but
Okay.
I guess they were.
Well,
might have
that is
been
a
in
topic that comes up in the actual review of this record.
Oh, okay.
And again, my opinion, and some other people who hold the same opinion, was that this record was actually less for the Beach Boys and more for Capitol Records.
That would
Okay.
make sense.
That would make sense. Okay. So, rushed through production, came out a little too quickly. Maybe, would you feel like this record has maybe some filler material on it?
Yeah.
Okay.
They kind of needed to fill in some B-sides
Okay.
to make way for the
Right.
singles.
It's also a short record. I think it's only about roughly like 26 minutes long.
Really?
Yeah. So, kind of
I
short.
never noticed that.
Yeah. Right.
Yeah.
Okay. All right. Well, I think we have a pretty good assessment there from a 21-year-old who is a little bit more into the later years of the Beach Boys and not so much into the early years of the Beach Boys. And I think you brought up some very good points. Kira is very thoughtful, and I know the other music that you listen to, and so it makes total sense to me that you wouldn't be into the high commercial end of the Beach Boys, and you're maybe more into, they're more experimental kind of stuff.
Yeah,
Okay.
definitely.
All right. Well, you heard it right there, folks. I think that's a very good assessment of this record, and from a generation that was born decades after this one came out. So there's still fans out there that listen to this music, and she has a very unique set of criteria that she has for music that she likes. So, Kira, thank you for joining us here on the Vinyl Review, and I think we're going to have you come back when we start talking about the Pet Sounds album, because there's probably a pretty good chance that you may have even listened to that record more than I have.
Probably.
Possibly. Okay. All right. Well, then you will probably have some very good insight that you can share with all of us. Okay. Again, this is Billy. This is Kira. And you've been watching the Vinyl Review. Please come back and join us again next time. Good night.